I think. Full professor
No,
thing.
it's full professor.
Yeah, I know, full professor. Yeah, I won't even be that when I retire.
Sí.
Cek. Cek, satu, dua, tiga. Cek, cek, cek. Cek, satu, dua, tiga.
Yeah, it's good we keep really busy. We did have a problem. Everything is okay. Yeah. Somehow, his computer and his computer did not
When it's some different version, so you can see there's like,
But now it's okay.
yeah.
Yeah, my water bottle.
We can start now.
Yeah, we're ready when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Switching.
What I could do is just, what happens at an academic conference, just tell you how many, what's the time, and put it on the podium. And just go over it. I'll just write it down and tell you the time. The clock time.
Yeah, sure. So, we do the alternate. Kemarin dia pernah telling me, oh yeah, kita kebaikan. Tell me how minutes. About 20 minutes. When I return ya untuk bisa
I don't know what's the total. I'll do an hour from the start, 1 hour.
let me know when I will.
Ya, selamat pagi semuanya. Good morning everyone, selamat pagi. Teman-teman mau hadir pada acara kita hari ini, yaitu acara fakultas. Kita bertemu lagi di ruang Rudi Budiman untuk kuliah umum. Dan kuliah umum kita hari ini akan kita bertemu lagi di ruang Rudi Budiman untuk kuliah umum. Dan kuliah umum kita hari ini akan dibawakan oleh Mr. Gordon Serbi and Dr. Wendy Kruger. Ya, our moderator is from, kami mempersilahkan Dr. mahasiswa S2 Ibu Novita Wendy, kami mempersilahkan Dr. Gordon, so give applause to them, Miss Wendy and Ibu Novita, please come forward please. So give applause to them. Ya, kuliah umum kita hari ini itu memiliki judul A Peace Studies Perspective. Ya, kuliah umum kita hari ini itu for understanding memiliki judul A Peace Studies Perspective on the use of religious paradigm for understanding geopolitical conflicts. Ya, sebelum kita memulai kuliah umum kita hari ini, saya mohon kesediaannya Ibu.
Bahasa Jawa Timur.
Bahasa Jawa.
Good morning, everyone. Okay.
Bahasa Jawa.
Good morning, everyone.
Okay. For those blessings, we thank you.
Our Heavenly Father, our gracious Lord, we thank you
For your blessings, we thank you
of our
that
busy
you
life.
gathered us today, and
in the midst
stop to learn
of our busy life,
so
we
bless
can
us,
pause,
speakers,
we can
stop to learn and to grow.
bless.
So bless us, bless every speakers, bless Gordon and Wendy, bless Ibu Novita, and may these seminars give us enlightenment.
Thank you
We
very
start
much.
these seminars only in your holy name. Amin.
Waktu dan serah dan tepat. Thank you very much, Mas. Ya, tanpa berlama-lama.
Ya, selamat pagi semua yang ada di sini dan juga yang mengikuti secara live streaming. Selamat pagi semua yang ada di sini dan juga yang mengikuti secara seminar kita di pagi live streaming atau juga bentuk rekaman. Namun dalam seminar kita di pagi hari ini akan dipresentasikan di dalam bahasa Inggris Indonesia untuk menolong kita mengikuti alur dari presentasi yang ada. Mungkin sebagian teman-teman tadi sudah melakukan scan pada QR code yang ada di luar ruangan. Bagi teman-teman yang secara online nanti dapat men-scan melalui layar tampilan presentasi yang akan disampaikan oleh Wendy, sehingga dengan adanya materi bahasa Indonesia itu mungkin akan menolong kita, begitu ya. Sekarang saya akan memperkenalkan dulu, begitu ya, untuk kedua tamu kita, sekalipun mungkin di lingkungan kita di UKDW kita sudah cukup mengenal mereka. Let me introduce both of you. Kedua pembicara kita berasal dari Kanada. Yang pertama adalah Ibu Wendy. Kedua pembicara kita berasal dari Kanada. Yang pertama adalah Ibu Wendy Kruger. Beliau adalah Associate Professor di Canadian Mennonite University, Kanada. Mengajar di dalam bidang Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies, serta juga program Magister Peace Building and Collaborative Development. Pernah juga menjabat sebagai Ketua Departemen tersebut. Gelar Master Teologinya dari Mennonite. Wendy Kruger memiliki latar belakang akademi yang kuat, gelar Master Teologinya dari Mennonite Lutheran Seminary di California, serta gelar Doktor dalam Peace and Conflict Studies dari University of Manitoba. Disertasinya menyoroti peran para pelaku perdamaian lokal di Mindanao, Filipina, sebuah tema yang terus menjadi fokus penting di dalam karya-karya beliau. Pengalamannya telah lebih dari 25 tahun, mencakup berbagai pelayanan karya maupun penelitian di berbagai tempat, termasuk di Asia, di dalamnya Filipina, Indonesia, Myanmar, India, dan Bangladesh, serta terlibat di dalam berbagai kegiatan komunitas lokal, para pemimpin agama dan organisasi masyarakat sipil dalam berbagai inisiatif perdamaian internasional. Kontribusinya juga terlihat melalui keterlibatan panjang dalam berbagai inisiatif perdamaian internasional. Saat ini termasuk bersama dengan Mennonite Central Committee dan Mennonite World Conference di Afrika. Saat ini penelitian beliau mencakup isu adaptasi komunitas terhadap tekanan iklim di Afrika yang semakin memperluas cakupan refleksi perdamaian dalam konteks global kontemporer sebagai bagian dari karya penelitian. Saat ini sebagai profesor. Lalu pembicara kedua kita adalah Gordon Serbe. Beliau menjabat saat ini sebagai profesor emeritus dan peneliti senior di Universitas Mennonite Kanada. Selama masa kerja penuh waktunya, ia mengajar mata kuliah terutama di bidang studi Alkitab dan teologi. Ia menjabat juga mengajar di bidang studi perdamaian, antropologi budaya dan agama-agama dunia. 27 tahun. Ia menjabat sebagai wakil presiden akademi selama 2 periode dengan total dari seminar 27 tahun. Gordon menerima gelar PhD-nya dalam studi perjanjian baru dari seminar Princeton Theological Seminary di New Jersey tahun 91. Sebagian besar dari antara kita mungkin belum lahir tahun itu, beliau sudah PhD. Sebelumnya ia adalah profesor tamu juga di kampus kita di UPDW pada tahun 2024. Gordon adalah anggota dari 40B Mennonite Fellowship dari Kanada dan saat ini menjabat sebagai ketua. Demikian biografi singkat dari kedua pembicara kita. Wendy and Gordon, nice to be with you here together. So I'm sure that the theme of our lecture is kind of important and relevant for our situation, especially in Indonesia now. And I'm sure that there will be some interesting thoughts in your presentation. So, Gordon and Wendy, I'm please. Kita berikan tepuk tangan buat kedua kita.
Selamat pagi. If you can turn to my first opening slide. If you can turn to my first opening slide. So you can see today that Gordon and I are collaborating on our
So you can see today that Gordon and I
on our clothing
are collaborating on our thoughts, and we tried to collaborate on our clothing as well this morning.
It is an honor.
It makes it easy to get dressed in the morning lecture. It is an honor for us to present today's public lecture. Terima kasih for the invitation.
Okay, we're looking for my PowerPoint. Okay, we're looking for my PowerPoint.
Yes, so you know our title, and I hope that you are following along. Yes, so you know our title, and I hope that you are following along on your
Catholic
phones.
Pope
Next
Leo
slide.
said recently that Christ's teachings
Rejected war.
Catholic
And that
Pope
moreover,
Leo said
God
recently
does not
that
listen
Christ's
to the
teachings
prayers of those
rejected
who wage
war,
war,
and that
but
moreover
rejects them.
God does not listen
US
to the
Vice
prayers
President
of
Vance
those who wage
responded
war,
by saying
but rejects them.
that when the Pope says
U.S.
that
Vice
God
President
is never on the
Vance
side of
responded
people
by
who
saying
wield the sword,
that when the
there
Pope
is a
says
more
that,
than
that God is
1,000-year
never on the
tradition
side of
just
people
war
who
theory.
wield the sword,
how do you say
there is a
that God
more
is
than
never on the
1,000-year
side of those who
tradition
wield
of
the
just
sword?
war theory.
Continuing, he
How do
said,
you say
I
that God
think
is
it's
never
very,
on
very
the side
important
of those
for
who
the Pope to
wield
be
the
careful
sword?
when he
Continuing,
talks about
he said,
matters of
I
theology.
think it's very, very
If you're
important
going to
for the
opine
Pope to
on
be
matters
careful
of theology,
when he talks about
you've
matters
got
of
to be
theology.
careful.
If you're going to opine on
Leo,
matters
now
of
speaking
theology,
from Cameroon,
you've
said,
got to be
Woe
careful.
to those who manipulate
Pope
religion
Leo,
in
now
the very
speaking
name
from
of God for
Cameroon,
their
said,
own military,
Woe to
economic,
those who
and political
manipulate
gain,
religion and the
dragging
very
that which
name
is
of God
sacred
for their
into
own
darkness
military,
and filth.
economic, and political
And
gain,
now, within
dragging
these
that which is
exchanges of
sacred
perspectives,
into darkness
US
and
Secretary
filth.
of Defense And now, within these exchanges of perspectives, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth spoke often of Christianity while leading prayer services at the Pentagon. In one of those meetings, Hegseth prayed for violence against those who deserve no mercy. He has on more than one occasion framed the war in Iran as divinely sanctioned, repeatedly invoking God's almighty providence and expressing certainty that God is on the side of the U.S. military. Standing in the Pentagon, he issued a call to American people for a specific kind of wartime prayer. He asked them to pray for victory in the battle and for the safety of the troops. Every day, on bended knees, with your family, in your schools, in your churches, he said, in the name of Jesus Christ. A few days later, he read out a sermon praying that wicked souls be delivered to the eternal damnation in the fight against Iran. Amid boasts about the U.S.'s superior firepower and their declaration of stupid rules of engagement, he promised to give no quarter to the barbaric savages of the Iranian regime and called on the American people to pray for victory in the name of Jesus. To illustrate various expressions of religion. One, some use it as a way to legitimize their warfare. Let's say, that person who leads the U.S. government. Number two, some use theology to criticize someone's initiation of warfare or of raising conflicting geopolitical dynamics. That's Pope Leo. And three, some see the war in religious frameworks, and that is Pete Hegseth. How are religious paradigms being used in the context of geopolitical conflicts? This is a significant question to ask, since how we think about religion often influences how we view conflicts and wars. The Israel-Palestine, Israel-Iran, and the United States-Iran conflicts are often discussed with particular religious interpretations, while simultaneously ignoring geopolitical realities. This public lecture will invite us to utilize peace studies to recognize religious paradigms in order to evaluate our religious attitudes towards conflict and understand geopolitical issues. Next slide. So here are our questions for today's lecture. What is the role of religion in the geopolitical framework? What are some frameworks for today's geopolitical conflicts? What religious paradigms are being utilized for legitimation or for forming alliances or generating sympathy? And what are some peace lenses and perspectives to use in the analysis? But before I address these issues from a peace theory lens, to help set context, Gord will provide an overview of the current geopolitical context. Gord? Next slide.
I'll start with the obvious, and that is that the world is now carved up into what are officially called states, which are defined as entities that have centralized authority over territory. Informally, we know them by other names like countries or lands or nations. Right now, there are 193 member states in the United Nations. We often take this state of affairs for granted, as if the way the world is organized now is somehow natural. But this is a fairly recent development in human history, and arguably it's simply an accident of history. States are now recognized to have sovereignty, territory, and jurisdiction. These are very crucial terms in political theory, and their meaning has been hotly debated. Now, when it comes to understanding armed conflict in regard to these states, It is important to observe that in regard to their governments, states are very differently structured, from absolute monarchies or oligarchies, which refers to the rule of the few, to some form of democracy. Now, democracies are often argued to be the least involved in armed conflict, but this can be debated. In fact, it does not seem that democracies with their easy moves to some form of populism or even authoritarianism wage wars any less than monarchies. Ironically enough, monarchies, in fact, are far better in their record of dealing with minorities within a state because they don't have to just listen to the majority. At the same time, states in their governing structures do not exist apart from societies that represent the people that are found within states. And often these societies have very complex demographic features. Societies governed within states can be very diverse and even polarized in terms of ideology, class, ethnicity and language, geographical regions, and even religion. But they can also be fairly homogeneous or coherent in regard to their culture, religion, and society. And the term for that ideal of coherence is called the nation state, when the nation corresponds to the authority structure. Now, what about religion, the role of religion in relation to the state or the associated society? The first and crucially important thing to note is that all religions do religion differently in regard to their social and political manifestations. It is impossible to describe religion in general or in the abstract as if it is some constant phenomenon in the way we posit the economic or the political. So on one side, for instance, we have personalistic and largely non-political forms of, say, Buddhism. And on the other extreme, we have highly political forms of Islam, say, or maybe even Hinduism. But at issue is neither Islam or Buddhism as such in some essential sense. Even a particular religion can have a quite different shape or role across a different society and at different times in regard to their expression or engagement with things social or political. All religions have incredible potential for shaping social and political dynamics in their own distinctive way. This discourse about religion today often refers to, or thus discourse about religion often refers to extremism, fundamentalism, or even moderation as different shapes of religion in a society. The nature, extent, and role of religion in a given society or in relation to the state then is very, very complex and different. Then there is the question of religion and the state, the authority structure in a society. The issue of how religion is associated with and gives support to or even legitimized by the governing structure is the question. Variation, again, is the rule. Some states have a state religion, an official religion, either officially or not. On the one extreme, we see the idea of the caliphate, where political and religious authority is completely fused. And we can observe cases where some states use the self-reference as an Islamic republic to describe their state. This is their self-reference. On the other side, we see fully secular states and thoroughly non-religious society, and maybe the most non-religious, at least in Europe, is the state of Estonia. Indonesia is a fascinating hybrid as a kind of religious democracy. It does not have one state religion, but 6 recognized state religions of a kind, and it embraces belief in the one God as a fundamental political principle, even as the government and the state is officially secular. Plenty of other officially secular states or secular governments are profoundly shaped by the religious fabric of the societies they govern. American civil religion, the technical term for this, is almost a special case where a certain kind of Christian piety is intimately and emotionally tied up with patriotic loyalty and seemingly giving blind support for its wars. And this form of Christian piety is now seeking to exert more and more influence on the governing structure of that country towards some goal of a return to an idealized Christian country. It's a scary thing. But there is a second major building block that needs to be noted at this point, and that is economic power in the form of transnational corporations, which often rival the power of the state. And this follows the legal innovation of what we call the limited liability corporation that was invented in the mid-1800s, which evolved from the joint stock companies that were the engine of European colonization. I don't have time to explain this really important history. These economic power forces are sometimes allied with particular states, and sometimes they are in massive conflict and rivalry with these same states or other states. They seek to play by their own rules, beyond the control and limitation of any sovereign state. And in some parts of the world, economic forces might be thought to be religiously neutral, but this would not be true of other parts of the world, for instance, influenced by some forms of Islam. In the 1990s, it was recognized by many observers that Islam in some areas of the world was able to provide a unique form of resistance to the forces of what were called neoliberal economic globalization. One of its many words, but this was an important concept at the time. So if the building blocks are states, how are they supposed to have relationships in the world? I think we need a next slide. I haven't been following the economic power. Sorry, I'll say when to change next. So very quick now. It's one of the few words I know. I need it for the bus. So, of course, we have the United Nations and all of the related institutions which have given us what we call a rules-based global relationship order. One of the reasons why this organization and its institutions was developed was precisely to avert the same level of destruction that was experienced in World War II, only 80 years ago. The most number of casualties ever in a war, the most extensive displacement of people in a war, massive changes in borders, and the unleashing of nuclear weapons of mass destruction. But the establishment of the United Nations has not stopped warfare in the world, even as the shape of armed conflict continues to evolve. Sadly, the memory of World War II is becoming distant, and the UN and its related institutions are now being seriously undermined by major powers. The UN was a problem from the beginning because they gave veto to big, powerful countries. Well, what do you expect is going to happen? So then we have, it's important to distinguish different types of armed conflict, and I think that I will skip this, but just a moment, only to say that the top two types of wars are well known. That is to say, when states are in conflict with one another, and when there is conflict within a country. And by the way, the second type of conflict is known to be now the most common form of armed conflict over this category. But often, by the influence of some other external power that's supporting a rebel movement or a separatist movement in a form we call a proxy war. What is interesting that many forms of separatist movements, maybe less so rebel movements which want to take over the government, are often fueled by religious impulses or religious sympathies. So what then about the alliances among states? Human beings, we make friends. We don't want to have enemies, but how do we make friends to help us in this troubled world? Well, this is a really important topic also of geopolitical analysis. But let me just say that the world is now organized around constantly shifting. The idea that the alliances that we have, ideas, norms, culture, values, and identities, including religion, in the way the international system is being organized. It assumes that international relations are not fixed by material or economic forces only, but constructed by social interactions, norms, and shared ideas, values, and even religion. It thus examines how identity shapes the interest of a state and its foreign policy. Now, in the 1990s, for many of you, this is a long time ago, but this is all happening in my history, and I could tell the story basically of my own personal awareness of these events. During the 1990s, after the Soviet Union ended as a state in 1991, this was also the decade as the high point of neoliberal economic globalization and the increase of trade systems across the world. Now, some American theorists argued that the goal of history has been achieved, that we were victorious, that the global capitalist system and its liberal democracy would live on forever and help the world to find its destiny. Wars over political and economic ideology would diminish, it was thought, as the victory of the free market and global capital would slowly spread across the world in a very positive way. But other thinkers were not so sure, especially those associated with the constructivist camp. Entities would be the primary source of conflict in the years after the Cold War ended. He posited the notion of different civilization as the highest category of cultural identity that would be increasingly common in the way people thought about and felt about geopolitical reality. He didn't say he wanted this, but he predicted that this would be the nature of the case. Huntington also predicted a major shift, therefore, in economic, military, and political power that would move from the West and move to other civilizations in the world, most significantly to what he called the challenger civilizations, the Islamic world and the world of China. And he argued that the widespread Western belief in the universality of its values and political systems is naive, and the continued insistence that everyone should develop that kind of democracy, he argued, would be naive and it would be resented. But I also must refer to critical theory, and I suppose that I might even put myself into this camp. It's a much more of a minority perspective because it's not the kind of theorizing that can advise governments with. It's inspired by Marxist analysis. And the framework takes special interest in the following issues. One, how inequality and power imbalances operate in a society and across the world. Number two, who controls the means of production? Number 3, how the exploitation works across states. Number 4, how economic powers and called corporations and political powers called states often work in alliance, even though some of these corporations have far more power than the states that think they rule the world. It's a famous book written in 1995 with the title, When Corporations Rule the World. It's a bit scary. At any rate, the modern analysis of this combined dynamic of the political and the economic is also called a study of, quote, political economy. And this framework offers new ways to understand new forms of empire and how the nature of war has in fact changed in this new context. For instance, Michael Hart and Antonia Negri in their book Empire in the year 2000 argue that unlike earlier forms of imperialism and colonialism, which were driven by competing political states, capital E empire today is network power. A global network of allied economic and political power that has no inside and no outside. In their sequel, Multitude, War, and Democracy in an Age of Empire, 2004, they argued that in the future, the world will be in a constant state of, quote, global civil war. They observed that the major powers that are part of the network called empire will no longer go to war against each other, but that the number of proxy wars and other interventions legitimized as police actions will accelerate. Asymmetric conflict, that is of one power against a lesser power, will increase and expand as the allied network of transnational sovereignty called empire engages in permanent, global, and often decentralized conflict. War in the postmodern world, they argue, is no longer a temporary interruption of peace, but a fundamental biopolitical tool for managing the masses and controlling economic and social life. Any means of ideology, whether religion or any other, will be employed in this process of trying to retain control of the globe. Back to Wendy.
We're now turning to situating peace studies. And I'm going to say, I think there are two key discourses that we can look at in terms of responding to the geopolitical context that Gord has just outlined. So, we now turn to the contributions of peace studies for understanding religious paradigms in geopolitical contexts. Peace studies is not a monolithic entity. And so, for this lecture, I'm only going to frame two discourses within peace studies. The first discourse of peace studies is focused on the questions that came through the international relations field. Gord has described this. This is often then referred to peace and security studies, conflict studies, war and conflict studies, security studies, or strategy studies. Those are names given to peace studies programs that are within an international relations field. The field of international relations is interdisciplinary and looks at mostly state actors across borders, encompassing global politics, economics, law, security, diplomacy. You've heard Gord talk about that. The key frameworks are realpolitik or liberal, and to that end, often employed to advise governments. When I go to the International Studies Association conference, many of those peace studies folks are in advisory roles to governments. And the focus of the strategies is top-down and state-to-state. And these frameworks are part of the traditional approach to international security stemming from the realist, state-centric focus, the development initiated in large part during the Cold War. So peace studies is a discipline that in many ways is derived from international relations. It was born from international relations, or we call it IR, as an alternative perspective for analyzing the complexity of the dynamics of relations between state actors or between state actors and non-state actors, which can range from those involved in terrorism, organized crime, to also NGOs and international media. Those groups have a large impact on the security of a region. The goal is to determine how one can prevent or manage war from happening on a global scale. Various methods are used so the world can be better than before, or at least return to a kind of civility. Peace studies within the liberal stream of IR has emphasized that peace can be obtained if countries in the world can be organized through a system or ideology similar to democracy. You can already hear the bias within this field. The combination of democracy and the liberal economy is considered as a solution to create world peace. The implementation of this system can create dependencies from one country and another, especially economic, which reduces, the theory goes, the possibility of war. Oliver Richmond, a European peace studies scholar within this discourse, has written much about the perspective of the liberal peace framework. The liberal peace theory claims that democratic states are more peaceful than non-democratic ones and do not go to war with each other. Think about what's happening today. Richmond states that the liberal peace theory has predominated in the contemporary peace debate, and liberal ideas of peace entail security, looking at political institutions, democracy, human rights, development, trade as the drivers of peace, and those were integral peace. So the victor's peace refers to military control or occupation, and this is the winner's story gets told, and the winner holds the power, strategic interests, often driven by imperial or colonial states. And the victor's peace is often exploited to maintain Western supremacy and asymmetric power relations in a global arena. The constitutional peace. It came to be assumed that if you have good laws, you're going to have peace. If you have good institutions, you have peace. Peace needed to be established upon the creation of both a domestic, political, and legal architecture, and an international architecture designed to balance interests, needs, and rights of the population. In other words, making international treaties and alliances would manage the balance of power. No one would stray from that, and we would all behave and hold ourselves together. The institutional peace. The aim of that is to anchor states within a specific set of values and a shared legal context to say, this is how we are going to behave. The idea is that if states with democratic constitutions share common goals of peace, free trade, human rights, and so on, human beings then would enjoy international peace and order. The last one, he says, is the civil peace. And this one asserts that every individual in society is capable of mobilizing peace from a variety of different perspectives, whether for disarmament, international cooperation against violence, discrimination, oppression. It's outside of that economic and political power. Now, the previous 3 points emphasize elite power, but it has become to be recognized that individuals and local communities have legitimate rights on their own for security, justice, basic needs, and autonomy. And this civil peace movement spawned the emergence of the second peace studies discourse I want to mention. So, second discourse now. First one is lodged within IR, highly connected to that state level peace. The second one, within a general peace studies, has now come to stand on its own, and this is in the form of peace studies or peace and conflict studies It's an interdisciplinary field that explores actions, assumptions, relationships, processes that lead to the conflict, as well as those that can transform and build peace. So as the field developed, began to pay more attention to peace and conflict issues from more critical, structural, global perspective. And this pushed the field beyond an earlier typology that peace studies students here should have heard it, Johan Galtung's positive or dynamic peace, and the opposite, negative minimalist peace. Now the study includes a wider range of historical, structural, cultural forms of violence, including political and economic violence of state and market, as well as epistemic violence, which is the privileging of Western white ways of knowing, and the rejection of other ways of knowing. Very long story of our challenge in Canada with that particular aspect. A critical and decolonial approach attends to discursive and material aspects of violence and looking at social processes that can ultimately transform. So not just prevent or manage, but transform. Exploring conflict as a complex process with different causes, phases, awareness levels, relational moments characterized by power relations, they recognized needed a new set of tools. Considerations began to include the practice through scholar practitioners, or what some of us call prac-ademics. So practitioner and academics within one person. Emerging since the late 1960s have been debates about how to understand conflict of peace, how to approach both of these phenomena. A vision of peace has morphed into something to be created rather than just something you try to maintain or restore. By the early 2000s, the peace studies field acknowledged, as McGinty and Richmond wrote, much of the debate on the liberal peace has been restricted to academics, policymakers, and students within the global north, and this is perhaps the single greatest failing of critical peace-building scholarship. The agency of the local ownership that is opening platforms for often unheard voices in contested spaces has now moved into the center of peace studies discourse. Thus, attention to grassroots, relationship-oriented practice and strategy, constructivist as opposed to essentialist or instrumental perspectives, the necessity of community connections, interdisciplinary problem solving with theoretical flexibility, and expanded conflict analysis became the markers of this second discourse. This space has strong connection with NGOs and community organizations. It's not talking to top-tier politicians. The result of this local and community focus opened the field to seeking out the particularities in a context and distanced it from high-level, top-down, generalized, and often, well, we say in Canadian English, cookie cutter. So when you make cookies, you have a cookie cutter and you make every cookie the same. Well, the IR field would say, United Nations, it can work for everyone. The human rights laws works for everyone. This second discourse says, cookie cutter is not the way to go. Next slide. So how is religion addressed in these two discourses? Looking to the IR-oriented peace studies field, several theoretical perspectives have been advanced to understand this contradiction of the role of religion as either good or bad, very essentialist. I think I have another next slide on this. Yes. Primordial approaches argue that religious differences inherently lead to conflict. Okay, we have different religions in the room, we will have conflict. In contrast, instrumentalist perspectives contend that religion merely provides convenient justifications for violence motivated by political economic grievances. And a third, A constructivist perspective suggests that religion is complex and is neither inherently peaceful or violent, but contains internal resources that can be mobilized in either direction depending on the historical, social, political context. Scott Appleby is someone who writes a lot on that topic. So understanding violence and questioning whether religion is violent or causes violence requires attention to specific theological, historical, political contexts in which it emerges, as well as psychological and social mechanisms through which religious meaning is constructed and contested. William Cavanaugh, who writes a lot on this topic, argues that the idea that religion is uniquely prone to violence is a myth, or a modern Western construction, rather than an objective fact. In his work, particularly in his book, The Myth of Religious Violence, Secular Ideology and the Roots of Modern Conflict, he argues that Western societies use this concept to label religious violence as irrational, while justifying that secular state violence is rational. Kavanaugh does not argue that religion is never violent, but that it is not more inherently prone to violence than any secular ideology. To oversimplify the role of religion and ignore the more complex social, political, national interests of states is problematic. For example, the work of John Esposito and Jeffrey Haynes emphasizes that Islam is not always a source of conflict, but can also function as a normative and political force. Islam can be seen as capable of influencing foreign policy, diplomatic processes, and global power relations through the values of justice, peace, and solidarity. Joseph Nye explains that values, identity, and moral legitimacy, this includes our religious values, can be utilized by states to build global influence without coercion. And this literature positions religion as a crucial variable in understanding our contemporary geopolitics. Gertjan de Jink, in his writing, When Geopolitics and Religions Fuse, a Historical Perspective, writes the following when he ponders religion and geopolitics. There is no real evidence for the assumption that religion is increasingly causing international conflicts, but some territorial conflicts like the Palestine issue have acquired a particularly vicious character by the involvement of religious fanaticism of many different types. Moreover, war, once started, always arouses religious sentiments about the adversary, even during the intra-European world wars of the 20th century. So think about any current conflict. What religious thinking does it arouse in you? What sympathy are you being attracted to? So we cannot say that identification within the state in Muslim countries inevitably veils itself in Islamic fundamentalism, because there is definitely a non-Islamic Indonesian, as we know, but it is striking that governments in countries such as Indonesia or Malaysia are often upset about the plight of non-national Muslims elsewhere in the world. There is strong support for Palestine here in Indonesia. Solidarity with Muslims in distant countries also reflect the deeper feeling of victimization in the Muslim world. This is not a religious vision per se. This may promote religiosity, but is not yet clear what it exactly means for religio-political visions. So, looking now at the second lens to peace studies as a perspective for examining the use of religious paradigms for understanding geopolitical conflicts. These peace scholars argue that traditional IR studies often fail by ignoring religion or reducing it to kind. Two IR scholars here in Indonesia, at the University of Indonesia, say we better start seeing things from a different perspective and consider non-security dimensions such as economic, identity, and environment, and how they can influence the dynamics of war. So there's increased significance for the role of non-state actors in the dynamics. Conflict with religious factors is typically organized to generating conflicts. You are probably thinking of places in the world where this is happening right now. Hartviken and Reisling say, religious belief systems have a particular identity-forming potential. Religion is not just individual, it is also social, offering each believer a sense of belonging to a community of fellow believers. With its reference to a transcendent source of truth and codification of shared norms, religion serves as a compass for the individual and the religious community alike, locating all believers in an extended ontological setting. Next slide. Key aspect of the peace studies perspective on the use of religious paradigms for understanding geopolitical conflict. It requires something multifaceted and critical, moving away from simple binary views of religion as inherently violent or peaceful. While recognizing that religious identity and discourse can fuel or justify conflict, peace studies researchers emphasize that religion is often intertwined with deeper political, economic, and social factors rather than being the sole problem of any tensions that we are looking at. There is a complexity required that without it, our simple binaries will further entrench the kind of conflicts we are living with today. And so into this space, next slide, emerged a theory called complexity theory, coined by Cedric de Koning in the mid-2010s. And this theory transformed peace-building approaches by shifting the focus from rigid, top-down, linear interrogations to more adaptive, complex approaches that respect local dynamics and emergent change. Traditional linear models often fail because they treat peace as just a problem to be solved. Let's just bomb until the problem is solved. Whereas complexity theory views peace as an emergent, context-specific process that cannot be imported from any other context. So this perspective treats the religious influence as a complex, self-organizing system that adapts to changing global landscapes and not simply confined to essentialist definitions. Religious actors then can suddenly become significant geopolitical players, with minor events causing major shifts, challenging traditional rational actor models. Complexity theory asserts that a religion operates as a spatial geopolitical force, offering both solidarity and at times exclusionary modes of world making, and it needs to be seen as a legitimate site of geopolitical agency. So this theory requires peace studies to move beyond treating religion just as a source of violence, clash of civilizations idea as one of the factors, or solely as a tool for peace, but to focus on its role in identity formation. Students, you are here for identity formation. So identity formation, looking at structural injustice, conflict transformation. Rather than just resolving, it focuses on transforming relationships and structural factors that create violence. So how one analyzes the religious perspectives and paradigms for the complexity that is the geopolitical context today is in itself, what we're trying to do here, a complexity. Consequently, as part of the field-wide effort to address epistemic violence and power imbalances within the knowledge production processes, peace scholars are increasingly being called to reflect not only on what they research, but how their own social, cultural, and professional locations shape that work. Can we really, as scholars, analyze outside of our own religion and experience? With the emergence towards the local turn, looking at local agency, and growing emphasis on decolonized peace building, the demand for methodologies that foreground transparency, accountability, inclusivity have intensified. So a local shift requires a shift from general and universal analysis to one that really looks at the particularities of the context. And these aspects of identity influence the research problems a researcher might be interested in researching. I've been listening to lots of students discuss their research question. You have to make methodological choices, and you are being shaped by your own social location as you think through the problems you're interested in working with. I will go to the conclusion slide. Next one. Taking religious paradigms seriously in the analysis of geopolitics, going beyond essentialist positions in geopolitical conflicts involves dismantling fixed, deterministic narratives. Think for yourself, what narrative tapes are running through your mind as you think about these geopolitical tensions? So, these deterministic narratives, such as the clash of civilizations, inherent ethnic hatreds. One of the classes I was in just finished looking at what happened in Poso, or geographical determinism, and moving toward analyzing complex power dynamics, constructed interests, fluid identities. So how does one sit in the messiness? This is a favorite word in the second discourse of peace studies, messiness. How do we sit in messiness that is the world? Here are 5 mindsets articulated by the Alliance for Peace Building. 1, integrate human security with state security, challenging state-centric approaches to diplomacy and instead focusing on how conflicts impact individuals and minorities towards a more inclusive and sustainable peace. Changing your mindset to thinking human security has merit. 2nd, research the post-colonial perspective. Challenge Western-centric narratives by examining the deeper economic, cultural, historical consequences of Western power. That's even scary for me to tell you to do that. Allowing for diverse regional perspectives on stability and development. 3rdly, be open to flexible alliances. Much of the tensions are because we have fixed alliances in who we think are our friends. Challenging you to be open to flexible alliances. Shift away from rigid Cold War style binary blocks towards flexible building block approaches. 3rdly, understand your own regional agency, recognizing the distinct interests and aspirations of regional actors rather than just viewing them or yourselves simply as pawns of greater power rivalries. Lastly, engage in really deep conflict analysis. Identify how transnational networks of corporations and arms manufacturers profit from and sustain conflict, rather than framing the conflict solely as a product of local cultural divisions. By adopting these approaches, actors can move from a deterministic view of conflict to a more agentic, agency-oriented perspective that allows for alternative scenarios and proactive rather than reactive policy. Next slide. Another lecture could unpack this verse that has its roots in discerning whether the Israelites should put their faith in an alliance with Egypt. Psalm 20 verse 7 says, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." An Irish Mennonite, when talking of that church's peace work, advised, "Open your mind to the possibility of the bigness of our own smallness." We can do much. When faced with fear, insecurity, or being outnumbered, the human heart is tempted to seek safety in strength, in control, or force, or influence. This temptation is universal. States have that temptation as well. Our decisions regarding what frameworks we tightly hold impact the role that we can have in the geopolitical context. Don't move to the last slide yet. When I do, move to the last slide. On the right is a quote by Pope Leo that 2 weeks ago was all over at least my Facebook world. People wondering what religious paradigm they should hold in geopolitical context. So you can read that as I move over there. Terima kasih. Thanks for this invitation.
This is a very rich and deep presentation and also provoking. So maybe we can continue with the session of question and answer. Jadi persilahkan kepada teman-teman sekalian jika ada pertanyaan, begitu ya. Pertanyaan bisa disampaikan di dalam bahasa Indonesia atau teman-teman bisa mungkin mencoba menggunakan Google Translate untuk menyampaikannya dalam bahasa Inggris, atau juga tentu bagi rekan-rekan yang ingin langsung berbicara dalam bahasa Inggris. Memperhatikan waktu yang kita punya, kita akan close itu di jam 10 untuk semua sesi kita termasuk pengumuman dan segalanya. Jadi kita punya waktu 30 menit begitu ya panitia untuk kita bertanya jawab. We have 30 minutes to question and answer. Baik, untuk sesi pertama 3 pertanyaan. Apakah ada yang mau menggunakan sesi ini dari teman-teman? Bisa angkat tangannya, nanti teman-teman dari panitia akan bantu dengan mikrofonnya. Ada? Oke, baik. 1 di depan, lalu di bagian belakang ada 1. Ibu tanya dulu, lalu yang di belakang, lalu ada 1 lagi mungkin, ya, yang di berkacamata di depan. Tolong sebutkan nama dan mungkin juga sedikit.
Hello, Wendy and Garden. It's nice to meet you again, Wendy. Last time when in the same place you spoke about storytelling, and now you were speaking about geopolitical, and it's quite new issue for me. And maybe my question is out of nowhere, but I really appreciate your presentation, and I will read my question. The first question is, what is contribution can peace studies offering in analyzing geopolitical situation that are co-opted by the logic of market capitalism? Because if we can see, and from my perspective, many wars are rooted not merely in politics, not merely in politics, but in economic interest, particularly the control of natural resources like land, oil, gas, so on and so forth. How can peace studies meaningfully engage with this ecological dimension of conflict? This is the first question. And the second question is, what is the role of theological institution or the church in shaping how communities understand global conflicts, such as Israel-Palestine, especially when Indonesia itself remains polarized by the internal conflict? like ethnicity differences, religious tension, LGBTQ exclusion, and so on and so forth. So that is my question. Thank you.
Silakan untuk penanya kedua tadi.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Wendy and Garden. It's finally I get to hear your lectures. I do not really have a question, but rather a simple thought that runs in my mind throughout the whole session. It's kind of long, so please bear with me. Since you began with how the Bible is often used to legitimize warfare, this reflection stay with me, and as a disclaimer, I am not trying to be sexist. But I do think that we need to honestly examine how and why violence, especially war, domination, and justification of power, is often associated with men. Many societies raise men to be dominant, assertive, and powerful. Masculinity is frequently tied to control, strength, and even aggression. So when we talk about war, including religious war, modern geopolitical conflicts, we cannot ignore how patriarchy shapes these dynamics. Many violent systems are sustained by structures of male dominance, and sometimes religions, including interpretation of the Bible, is used to legitimize that power. And like you said, the issue is not simply religion itself, but how religion is interpreted and mobilized within the geopolitical systems. And that's just my thoughts. So going back to the first slide of Trump and Pope Leo, thank God we have Pope Leo. That's it. Thank you.
Silakan penanya ketiga tadi. Oh, silakan. Agak di tengah, Kak. Ya. Boleh angkat tangannya lagi supaya mikrofonnya. Ya.
Okay, good morning, Wendy and Garden, and our lecturers, our friends from theology study. And first of all, I want to say thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture. I have seen you a lot on here campus, but I always wanted to know your lecture, and I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful. So yesterday I read a book about this politics, and I guess we all know the books that because this was written by our lecturer, Professor Emmanuel Gerit. The title is Faith and Politics in the Reformation Era in Indonesia, and the book mentioned this one term that I like. It was stigmata. Stigmata means each of us carries Christ's scars and characters who invite us, his co-workers, not just to win with him, but also the most important thing is to lose and to suffer with him. Or in other words, I say, to start from below. What I'm curious about is this: if we pay more attention to what kind of our beautiful state is, Indonesia, which is one of the greatest Islamic states on the world. So could you please mention ways to be present as stigmata to help us to help and to hold the religious paradigm in geopolitical context by using the two discourses and of peace studies, and also to help us as to anticipate international conflicts, security threats, and economic competitions that is happening everywhere around us nowadays. Thank you.
Baik, terima kasih untuk 3 penanya. Kini kita akan berikan waktu bagi Gordon dan Wendy untuk menjawab.
Justin? This is in response to question number 2 back there. It's funny, in our conversations between Wendy and me, she's complaining about the behavior of some men, and she's just like men. Are all men just the same? But let me say that I mentioned 3 mainstream theoretical perspectives in international relations, and I refer to 1 more minority theory. There's also feminist international relations perspectives, where that gender element is being very carefully interrogated. But you can only say so much in 1 lecture. In a course I teach on aggression, violence, and war in social science perspective, we read neurobiology, anthropological literature on violence, and one of the interesting books, for instance, we read is a book by a Harvard anthropologist, and the title is Demonic Males. And he argues that male coalitionary violence deep in human history has caused humans to adapt and evolve in a particular way, and we just have not gotten over our interest in domination, and this form of what was originally a survival tactic is now counterproductive and destroying us and our world. So this is an extremely important subject that should be carefully interrogated, and maybe Wendy has another comment about this.
See if I can read my notes here. Well, interestingly, to the second question, the 2 of us decided that I would remove a statement regarding masculine identities as shaping some of the geopolitical dynamics that we talked about here today. Thinking, oh, do we have enough time to talk about that issue? So if I put it in, is that just, then I have to unpack it, and then now, you know, these are some of the decision-making processes in a lecture, how much time you have to unpack something. So thankful for your question. Yes, my partner and son do sometimes accuse me of being sexist towards men. And this is the challenge in this lecture. Can we say, oh, those Christians, oh, those Christian Zionists, oh, those terrorists? It's challenging with generalizations. It does help us capture a trend, and on the other hand, we are generalizing and losing people's particularities. And we want that own attention to our own particularities in terms of how we are living out our life. But to say this is a huge challenge in the field, mostly European men, peace studies field, and they get paid a lot to advise governments, and more women are in the field. The second discourse of peace studies as conflict transformation, that's the group that I'm in. And yeah, you're advising communities and NGOs, and so sometimes you don't get paid for that work because you are entering the lives of people and the questions that they are asking. So yes, patriarchy is strong, it impacts, and this is why, and also moving to your question, this complexity theory I find helpful. When we get stuck on a particular issue, we have to keep unpacking.
So I said as an example in a class the other day, it's like this onion, it's got all these layers and you got to peel away to figure out what really is going on. And that's why in the mindset list is engage in deep conflict analysis. Now I don't know about you, but when I start cutting onions, I often start crying. And these are issues to weep about. So I like that image of the onion, and that work can cause maybe even trauma for us, but certainly sadness for the state of the world. We have to analyze, why is patriarchy given the opportunity to be so dominant? Why are we co-opted by capitalism? And it's true, a lot of corporations with their corporate social responsibility, CSR funds, try to come alongside peace organizations and say, hey, we can help you and give you all this money. And I have seen community organizations deteriorate because that money is so enticing, and then you start trying to please the donor, and now car manufacturing companies in Japan and the US and maybe other places are being asked to retool to become arms manufacturers, because way more arms, turns out, are needed for the kind of war that was initiated in February. So this idea of the complexity, let's keep unpacking what allows for this, what generates or drives some of the dominances that we see, is important to understand so that our narratives don't become so fixed and binary that we find it difficult to adapt and make some of the changes that are necessary. And so a question of what's the role of theological institutions. I've been impressed by the Faculty of Theology here with always asking, what's the application to your context? Maybe I would push and say, know the application to your context, but do you also understand other voices that are engaged in some of the same questions? So pushing you to always trying to expand the analysis that you can do for the insights that you might receive. Does this prompt something you want to respond to?
First of all, we want to thank you for your patience in listening to our fairly complex, conceptual, abstract language in this lecture. And that's why we tried this Bahasa Indonesia Google translation, but I can't tell you how good it is. But we do want to acknowledge that we were using a kind of language that we would not normally want to. But we felt the demands of the topic required it for a moment. At any rate, 30 years ago on a Friday night, I was walking down the street in a place called Dumaguete, Philippines, and I met some of my students, and I said, oh, where are you going? Oh, he said, we're going to a study group on MOP. I didn't catch what MOP was right away, and then they said, mode of production. They're in a political discussion cell group as seminary students. They're engaging with trying to understand their reality in a ideological, or in the framework of pulling apart what's really going on in the world. And I was totally impressed to some degree. And so the question was, well, how does the church work at this? In part, we maybe have to have more cell groups that do this kind of thing. Now, I'm a Bible scholar that is interested in certain questions. So one of my questions as a Bible scholar is, what prompted Jesus, when he turned 30, to minister and teach in the way he did? Now the easy answer is, oh, he was the Son of God and he just got it from God and he passed it on. For me, the question is a bit more complex than that, and I'm interested in the human element. My own thinking is that Jesus was a migrant laborer in his 20s. When you're a migrant laborer, you have direct contact with the marginal in society. You cross boundaries, you meet people, and maybe he was in cell group conversations about what's the meaning of our scripture, with these very practical realities all around this. And so it's from this groundwork element that we come to consciousness. The pedagogy of the marginalized is to analyze our situation and gain resource and strength to help us discern and to test what's going on. And so I think this is very important, and I just read a new article from Pop Garrett where he argues that public theology discourse is not paying enough attention to the marginalized in the way they do their analysis. Well, these are very profound thoughts, and I wish I could answer more precisely the question that follows up on the contributions of our beloved professor who is sitting right here. And so I must confess, I really don't know how to fully answer that, except that I would like to be in further discussion about that in the way we, because I don't know all of the histories around some of the very important conversation that Bob Garrett has offered to us.
Let me give just two examples of groups who are struggling with the questions that have been expressed and are trying to work at a multifaceted approach. So one is the Palestine-Israel Network of the Mennonite Church in Canada, and the other is Lakan Sumulong, who is a Mennonite worker in the Philippines. He is Filipino and his work is in the Philippines with Mennonite Church Canada. They focus on doing political, economic analysis, and to that end, they are working on divestment strategies, boycotts, analyzing what are the transnational corporation influences into the Israel-Palestine context. And so they're researching certain things and organizing boycotts, divestments. They are recognizing, or their statement is that Christian Zionism is connected to political lobby, and they're looking at what are the benefits, what is the articulation, what is the narrative, and educating church people in our circles who would be somewhat inclined to the biblical interpretation of Christian Zionism, to perhaps push what they would maybe call Jesus' good news message of someone asked here about, what does it mean to have a Jesus on the cross, and looking at marginalized, and so bringing that message, which is the message that Vice President Vance has really mocked about Pope Leo, that he pays attention to poor and marginalized. And then they are listening to Palestinian theologians and their liberation theology articulation. So trying to understand another theology, another articulation. So you have the Palestine liberation theologians, you have the Christian Zionists, you have the economic policies looking at, boycotts, divestments, but they're very deliberately trying to be multifaceted in their approach and engagement on the wars of that region. So that gives kind of an example about what some folks are trying to do, and within that, lots of conversation around patriarchy,
In US especially, Mennonite Action, which is a group of young activists, is looking at the treatment of trans people, LGBTQ in general, as to say, we're looking at liberation for one group of people, where none of us, Paulus Wijaya said in class the other day, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. So we don't just work for our own salvation or our own security, but we must expand to a heart for global security and doing analysis at all of these different kinds of levels.
One more small thought on the engagement in the public. As I said, I just read quickly, I need to digest it, a short article by Pak Garrett, I think just 2025. The argument is that when it comes to public theology, if I can summarize this, Muslim religious leaders and Christian religious leaders need to learn a public theology of not competing with just developing their own identities to defend their own role in a society, but to learn how to collaborate and cooperate on behalf of the marginalized. This is, I think, a very fascinating proposal and important one. Just one small example of how religion, therefore, needs to be done in cooperative terms in many contexts.
Thank you. So many things to deepen, and I'm sure that there will be, I hope there will be more time, but we have a little time now, but maybe we have still time for one.
Yeah, one round.
Yeah. Okay, is there anyone? Just one people? Okay. Panitia.
Mungkin satu round lagi, ada dua atau tiga orang masuk.
Firstly, I want to say thank you for the incredible lecture. Actually, I want to make sure again so I don't misunderstood. And I guess this isn't a really hard question. So I'm interested by one of the points in the conclusions, which says, be open to flexible alliances, shifting from rigid, Cold War style binary blocks to a flexible building block approach like ASEAN to Indo-Pacific security. What are some concrete ways to make this happen? That's it, thank you.
Okay, well, satu lagi, maybe there is one, because this is a very short question. So, is there anyone want to join this session? No? Okay.
When we arrived here in Indonesia, we came towards the end of January. The big conversation was around your president's decision to join the Board of Peace. And that has continued to be a conversation. And did he pay the fee, the full fee to join? And in some ways, that's a new alliance, but it's based on old politics. So I think now your president's saying, maybe now that I know this group more, that's maybe not a good idea to be in this group, thinking it was something new, and then realizing, no, it's the same political rules as all the old alliances were. And part of that comment of moving to flexible alliances is a push to more deeply analyze what is power, how to use, or what's the impact of how we choose to use power, and to know there are different choices. or different types of power. And probably those of us in the room here would say, oh, we don't have that much power. Well, Erica Chenoweth, who is a quantitative social scientist and is looking at how well nonviolence works for the conflicts in the world. And her discovery is that if any society has a committed group of 3.5%, only 3.5% of the population is committed to alternative uses of power and doing it non-violently, they have the power to shift the political dynamics in their region. Now, it means you have to be committed as the 3.5. But she's trying to push new kinds of alliances to ask, are you interested in doing it non-violently? Let's make another kind of group and alliance. And there are now global groups emerging around the US, Iran, Palestine, Israel, dynamics to say, let's create alternative types of power and alliances. So what are concrete ways? Looking at groups that are emerging to say, old style, old patriarchal, strongman politics is not the alliances that I want to join. So that's a personal kind of thing of looking around. There are really interesting groups emerging that one can be a part of. The other is more political engagement to say, to push your elected officials to talking with different kinds of people. And I think there have been stories about your president having conversations with some different voices, and that's why maybe this full story has not happened yet on that issue here in Indonesia. So if we stay with the traditional post-World War II power blocks, those old animosities, those colonial legacies, thinking a certain kind of knowledge is superior to another kind of knowledge, those old kind of alliances, if they remain as the only alliances that exist, we're in for more of what we're experiencing today. So the Alliance for Peace Building is a international NGO, and it is trying in its work to find new people to talk to, voices that are not getting heard, and that can happen at a macro level and your own micro level. Who are you talking to? Whose stories are you listening to that can help you be more flexible in your analysis and give you a different group of people to work together with in cell groups or smaller pieces of society that can grow into larger pieces? That's a quick answer to that.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure there will be so many other things to be deepened, but we have a time limit, so maybe you can prepare your closing statement. Yeah. So peace studies is become more and more important in our life, and especially in this messiness situation of the world. So maybe you have your closing.
I'm thinking about it right now.
I thought Wendy just had a very good closing statement just before you asked for one.
Okay, meanwhile, you still have time?
If you want, I'll say one more thing. Maybe to repeat some of what I just answered, but put it into a closing statement framework.
I'll go back to the statement that the second discourse of peace studies is pushing the need for something that is creative, complex, and multifaceted. And that push is both for us personally, as well as on a larger scale of engagement. So it pushes us to listen to new voices, to not be stuck with and co-opted by these traditional definitions of what power is, and to rather engage in your time here as a student, say, how can I resource myself for the messiness of the world by hearing as many different viewpoints as possible from my professors and from voices they introduce you to in class, because the world is messy out there, and it's important to have thought about what's your narrative, what narratives you're open to, what Jesus are you following, because that shapes how you will engage in and walk in the world.
Thank you for today for your presentation. Acara kita berlanjut dengan we have some information from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon, Mrs. Wendy, and Gunavita for presentation. And please give them one more applause. Untuk waktu dan tempat, saya persilakan Pak Franz untuk beberapa pengumuman.
Mereka bisa.
Mr. and Mrs. Can sit and together with us.
Ya, selamat pagi saudara. Ada beberapa pengumuman, waktu kita nggak banyak. Minggu depan kita ada PA kembali, dan tanggal 12 Mei nanti ada diskusi teologis dari teman-teman yang pemenang paper terbaik. Karena itu pagi ini akan disampaikan beberapa pemenang paper terbaik untuk program sarjana dan pasca sarjana. Pak Daniel akan menginformasikan untuk yang program sarjana, nanti Pak Andi akan menyampaikan yang pasca sarjana.
Pengumuman pemenang. Ada banyak banget paper yang dikirim para dosen dan dinilai oleh 2 orang juri, Pak Adika dan Pak Yosef, dipilih 5 terbaik. Saya akan bacakan pemenang kelima, namanya siapa, judul papernya apa, dari mata kuliah apa, supaya dosennya ikut gembira juga. Pemenang kelima, ini nanti yang menang-menang, saudara, Anda dapat voucher. Yang menang-menang. Dan artikelnya dikirim ke Arada, ya. Silakan dikirim ke Arada, akan pakai jalur khusus. Jalur khusus berarti diasumsikan sudah dibaca oleh reviewer dan oleh editor, sehingga bisa langsung dilihat lagi setelah diedit, tentu saja dengan baik ya, dengan bahasa yang lebih bagus. Pemenang kelima dari mata kuliah pneumatologi, judulnya Discernment yang Tumpul, Kritik Pneumatologis Filosofis terhadap Rasionalitas Negara dalam Krisis Ekologis Indonesia, karya saudari Jumitri Angelik Rampumana. Silakan Jumi, maju ke depan. Menang terus di Jumi setiap semester kayaknya ya. Paper terbaik keempat dari mata kuliah Pemikiran Filsafat dan Teologi Kontemporer, Judulnya Dari Logos ke Poiesis, Teopoetika dan Transformasi Bahasa dalam Teologi Radikal Kontemporer. Judulnya aja susah sekali dimana. Karya Edgar Ernala. Ganteng kali kau hari ini. Terbaik ketiga dari mata kuliah Pemikiran Filsafat dan Teologi Kontemporer dengan judul paper Pengkhotbah 4 ayat 1-6, sebuah pembacaan teopoetik dalam kerangka Theopoetics of Trauma, Shelley Rambo, karya Saudari Louis Angel Isabel Boruginti. Oh, sudah siap dia rupanya pakai. Tahu dia mau menang kayaknya ya. Pemenang terbaik 2 dari mata kuliah Hermeneutik Perjanjian Lama, syukur pada Allah, dengan judul paper Melihat Melalui Lensa Behaviorism, Tafsir Kejadian 27 ayat 41 sampai 28 ayat 9 dengan pendekatan stimulus, respons, dan operating condition, karya Saudara Pandu Widya Pujo Putranto. Tidak ada. Mau diwakili pacarnya? Sahabatnya? Ya sudah. Paper terbaik pertama dari mata kuliah pneumatologi, judulnya Skandal Pneumatologis Saat Manusia Menjadi Tuan dan Menjadikan Roh Allah Gelandangan di Bumi, dalam kurung sebuah tinjauan pneumatologi persahabatan terhadap krisis ekologis di tanah Sumatera, karya Saudari Lira Angela Syafia. Iya sudah, tidak ada. Minta kesetiaan Prof Yahya untuk dapat menyerahkan kepada para peserta. Dan akan difoto ya kan, mari. Oke, makasih. Saya serahkan ke Kaprodi S2 yang juga lebih satu posisi 2 ya.
Baik saudara-saudara, untuk yang program magister, pembagiannya adalah bukan pada urutan sebetulnya, lebih kepada dua terbaik dari setiap kajian, dan bisa jadi yang menang adalah yang mengambil kuliah itu bukan sebetulnya mahasiswa pada kajian tersebut, pada bidang minat tersebut, tapi karena mengambilnya sebagai pilihan dan kemudian menjadi yang terbaik. Jadi ini berdasarkan kajian. Untuk yang pertama, kajian Biblika, Bible Studies, terbaik pertama ini adalah kelompok Saudara Gusti Ayu Ketut Lintang Indah Esterlita, Saudara Rosnani Butar-Butar, Saudara Daniel Sijabat, Saudara Michelle Tande. Kalau hadir bisa maju bersama-sama. Lalu pemenang kedua adalah Saudara Novita. Sorry, saya lupa membaca ininya judulnya. Untuk yang pertama, ini judul papernya adalah sebuah pembacaan lintas tekstual komunitarian antara teks Kejadian 37 ayat 1 sampai 36 dengan surah Yusuf 12 ayat 1 sampai 22 oleh komunitas Kristen dan Ahmadiyah Yogyakarta, mata kuliah hermeneutik lintas tekstual komunitarian. Silakan Saudara Lintang dan kawan-kawan, Saudara Rosnani dan kawan-kawan bisa maju ke depan. Nggak ada tepuk tangan, nggak kenal ya. Gitu mungkin lah. Yang kedua adalah saudara Novita dengan mata kuliah kritik ideologi, judulnya Segala Ideologi Ada Masanya, Dinamika Ideologi dalam Kitab Pengkhotbah serta Klaim Kepatuhan kepada Raja, Pengkhotbah 8 ayat 2 sampai dengan 9. Silakan saudara Novita. Untuk bidang minat kajian teologi publik, judul papernya adalah Fandom Antara Ruang Sakral dan Arena Ikonoklasme, mata kuliah teologi dan budaya populer, saudara Fitria Rambu Sabati. Tidak ada? Yang terbaik kedua, judul papernya adalah Dari Tontonan ke Konsumsi Analisis Teologi Publik atas Praktik Live Streaming dan Impulsive Buying dalam Budaya Populer Indonesia, mata kuliah teologi budaya populer, saudara Ingrid, saudara Ingrid. Orangnya tidak ada. Baik. Lalu yang bidang minat atau kajian ketiga adalah kajian konflik dan perdamaian. Judul paper Tubuhku Bukan Lagi Milikku, Trauma Kekerasan Berbasis Gender, Online Cyber Grooming dalam Perspektif Teologi Tubuh, mata kuliah politik tubuh dan isu gender, saudara Marta Uli Batubara. Kayaknya anak S2 nggak ada semuanya, gimana nih? Aduh, saya udah wajibin nggak ada yang datang ya. Mata kuliah yang terbaik kedua untuk mata kuliah kajian konflik perdamaian, Perjuangan Menemukan Rumah Terakhir, Afirmasi Kebertubuhan dalam Teologi Tubuh Lisa Iserwood sebagai upaya rekonsiliasi jati diri korban trauma dan body shaming. Mata kuliahnya sama, politik tubuh dan isu gender, saudara Fitria Rambu Sabati lagi dan tidak datang. Yang bidang minat terakhir adalah kajian teologi praktis dan termasuk di kepemimpinan di sini. Terbaik pertama, judul papernya adalah Roblox sebagai ruang perjumpaan iman, membangun pendidikan Kristiani relasional generasi Z dengan media Roblox, mata kuliah pendidikan Kristiani, saudara Andesita Meriawati Dwi Windarti saudara Dwi Windarti. Ada? Besok saya akan mengeluarkan surat peringatan kepada teman-teman S2 ini gimana ini. Cuma 2 yang datang. Yang terbaik kedua untuk bidang minat ini adalah pendidikan Kristiani berbasis relasi dan percakapan, upaya merespon fenomena kesepian Gen Z di era digital, mata kuliah pendidikan generasi Z, saudara Yoel. Tidak ada lagi. Baik, kalau gitu kita akan memberikan penghargaannya. Saya mau minta Pak Oce udah keluar ya? Oh, Pak Oce bisa minta tolong Pak Oce untuk maju ke depan memberikan. Baik, terima kasih, selamat. Saya serahkan Pak Afres, sudah selesai. Oh, sorry.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Andi, Pak Daniel untuk pengumuman pemenang paper, dan selamat kepada para pemenang. Kiranya teman-teman juga bisa memberikan apresiasi tepuk tangan kepada para pemenang. Ya, apakah masih ada lagi Pak Frans? Oke, tidak ada. Teman-teman, kami ada form penilaian dari BPMF, jadi teman-teman akan kami beri waktu 5 menit untuk mengisi form. Ya, ini silahkan di scan dan diisi. Terima kasih teman-teman.
Ya, bisa.
Bukanya doa.
Ya teman-teman, ini bersifat wajib ya, jadi tolong diisi juga. Aman ya teman-teman, barcode-nya bisa di-scan semua.
Aku nggak bisa. Oh nggak bisa. Sudah.
Iya harus request ya.
Oh, itu
kalau
harus
nggak
pakai. Jadi nggak usah apa pakai ini pak email student.
Oh itu harus dibuka setnya kayaknya supaya jangan terbatas. Oh itu ngesetnya ke ke student.
Iya.
Saya aja tetap nggak bisa.
Oh oke oke baik baik nanti akan kami ngomong ke BTS.
Berarti terbebas dari kewajiban.
Ya, untuk doa penutup kami mohon kesediaannya Pak Hadi untuk memimpin dalam doa.
Baik teman-teman, kita akan tutup kuliah umum pada hari ini ya bersama-sama dalam doa. Sekali lagi terima kasih banyak Pak Gordon, thank you very much Pak Gordon dan Bu Wendy, Saudara Novita, terima kasih banyak. Kita semua belajar tentang sesuatu yang sangat kompleks sebetulnya sebagai sebuah bagian dari kita melakukan studi, tetapi saya juga berharap bahwa kompleksitas ini juga membantu kita bukan hanya pada masalah-masalah yang bersifat akademis, tapi juga sampai kepada bagaimana kita melakukan sesuatu secara praktis sebagai orang-orang yang akan hidup dan berada di tengah-tengah gereja. Semoga kita bisa belajar cukup banyak pada saat ini. Mari kita sama-sama tutup dalam doa. Tuhan Allah yang baik, kami mengucap syukur kalau kami boleh menggunakan waktu kami bersama-sama untuk kembali belajar dan melihat bahwa apa yang sedang kami alami dan kami hadapi adalah sesuatu yang menuntut kami untuk memiliki lebih banyak kebajikan, memiliki lebih banyak pertimbangan, sehingga kami tidak menyederhanakan persoalan. Terutama pada apa yang kami pelajari pada saat ini, bahwa di dalam nilai-nilai agama yang kami hidupi, kami perlu menemukan jalan untuk mensupport perdamaian, untuk mendukung cinta kasih, sehingga dunia ini dapat hadir dan hidup lebih baik dari waktu ke waktu. Tuhan, biarlah ini semua boleh dikuatkan oleh Engkau sendiri, dan kami semua juga dapat belajar